Good afternoon. Welcome to Bethesda Green's Innovation Lab's Summer Speaker Series, Tackling Environmental Challenges Through Sustainable Entrepreneurship. During this series, we are discussing ideas that impact people, the planet, and profits. My name is Patty Simonton, and I'm the director of the Be Green Business Program here at Bethesda Green. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this third session of the summer series, where we'll discuss the impact of reduced biodiversity on our food supply. The session will be recorded. I invite you all to use the chat to introduce yourselves and also to share any questions you may have for our panelists. I'll do my best to incorporate audience questions throughout the conversation and during a Q&A session at the end. Farms are ecosystems, and it all comes down to the soil. These delicate ecosystems have so far demonstrated quite some resilience against growing commercial agricultural pressures, but the impact of climate change, bringing its increasingly severe weather, is testing that resilience. During this session, we'll hear about why biodiversity is such an essential part of our food system and discuss how all of us, not only the agricultural community policymakers, can work to preserve it. For today's conversation, I'm pleased to welcome three panelists who can speak to the role biodiversity plays in our food system and some of the ways farmers and other stakeholders can preserve it. Ryan Nebeker is a research and policy analyst for FoodPrint, an educational nonprofit that aims to help people understand where their food comes from and how our food system impacts people, animals, and the environment. Ryan has an MS in Agriculture, Food, and Environment from the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University, where he worked on exploring connections between climate change, soil health, and human health. He's produced numerous reports on food system issues for FoodPrint, like regenerative agriculture, the rise of plant-based meats, and an upcoming deep dive on the impact of wild-caught seafood. Nathaniel Jackson is the CEO and co-founder of TrueAlgae, which produces an organic and proprietary soil amendment booster containing useful metabolites that are expressed in the cultivation of algae in vertical photobioreactors. TrueAlgae has been selling its TrueSolid product to small and large farms around the United States and has license agreements in Canada and Mexico. Nathaniel is passionate about the importance of soil health and biodiversity for positively impacting the quality of food and ultimately healthy bodies. He is also a founding partner of Next Impact Ventures. Next stands for New Exciting Technologies. Prior to his role with TrueAlgae, Nathaniel worked at the Inter-American Development Bank, where he was a senior advisor of opportunities for the majority, chief advisor to the vice president of private sector operations, and a senior investment officer for the Structured and Corporate Finance Multilateral Investment Fund. Jesse Womack is a policy specialist at the National Sustainable Agricultural Coalition. Jesse grew up working as labor on various farms and holds a BA in environmental studies from Gustavus Adolphus College and a master's in food and agricultural law and policy from Vermont Law School. After undergrad, Jesse served as an AmeriCorps Vista, developing programming for local food farms and businesses in southern Minnesota. Jesse transitioned from that role to leading a 9-county agricultural resilience study while coordinating programming for the Feast, local foods network. Most recently, Jesse worked with the Nature Conservancy in Ohio to improve water quality and carbon outcomes by promoting conservation practices to farmers. Thank you all for being here. Let's jump in. I'm going to throw my first question to Ryan. The Chesapeake Bay is home to over 3,600 different species. Pressures caused from excess runoff, pollution, and sedimentation are putting the biodiversity of the Chesapeake at risk. Can you please help set the stage a bit for the conversation by defining biodiversity and describing why it is such an important component of our food system?
Sure, and thank you for having me. So biodiversity, simply put, is just the way we talk about the enormous variety of life that we see on Earth. Pretty much every corner of the planet is filled with life in one form or another. All of it has evolved specially to fit in that tiny corner and perform very specific purposes. Scientists estimate there's about 8.7 million different species of plants, animals, mostly microorganisms, all of them interacting with each other. At just the most macro level, that biodiversity is critical for maintaining life on Earth. All these cycles, people are aware of things like the water cycle, but there's a carbon cycle, there's a nitrogen cycle, there's the constant way that the oxygen we breathe is replenished. All that biodiversity is critical for maintaining a functioning biosphere. When we talk about people and biodiversity, agriculture is one of our easiest routes in. It's out of everything that human beings do, it's probably the thing that is maybe the most connected to nature, right? Living things produce everything we eat, and everything that we farm is sort of embedded in a natural system. And there's a huge variety of, how much it looks like that today. But at the end of the day, everything relies on nature. So when we talk about biodiversity in agriculture, there's kind of two big splits. There's wild biodiversity and the way that it impacts agriculture and that agriculture impacts it. And then there's biodiversity within agriculture, which just kind of refers to the enormous variety of cultivated things that we have developed throughout history, and also to the diversity that exists in those ecosystems we create. As you mentioned in the introduction, farms are ecosystems, and they have the potential to be just as complex as the wild ecosystems around them. So, as I mentioned, when we talk about wild biodiversity in agriculture, one of the things that we worry the most about is the impacts of our agricultural practices on the nature around us. We see that with water pollution and runoff that negatively impacts water quality, harming watersheds. We see this, clearly in the Chesapeake, where there's a huge diversity of aquatic organisms, some of which have been driven to close to extinction by human activities over the course of the last several centuries. But then that wild biodiversity is also critical for maintaining life on the farm. Insects provide pollination, they provide pest control, and perhaps most critically, there's a huge interplay between wild and cultivated biodiversity in the soil. Soil is a living thing. Plants don't just grow in dirt. They are constantly putting out sugars, chemical signals that cultivate communities of microorganisms that help them collect nutrients from the soil. They're in constant communication with fungi, insects, and microorganisms in the soil. Tiny animals that we can't see with the naked eye are always circulating nutrients. So even when we don't see it, that diversity is there, and it's critical to maintaining these ecosystems, both wild and cultivated.
Thank you for that. Jesse, could you please talk a bit about some of the environmental and industry pressures that are impacting the makeup of soil and biodiversity as a whole around the country?
Sure. Well, I'll sort of build on Ryan's comments and just note that, like, when it comes to industry pressures on the environment and agriculture in particular, often what we see is sort of a tendency towards the opposite, right? Industry sort of views specialization as inherently more efficient and therefore more profitable. And on the landscape, that really looks like monocultures, right? So we've seen a very large portion of arable land in the United States transformed into one form of monoculture production or another. The most glaring example of this is the massive amount of rich agricultural ground in the Midwest that is dedicated to corn and bean production every year. I say corn and bean, but really it's corn or bean in any given year, and then maybe you rotate between the two if you're at least passingly concerned with your soil health. And that's sort of the state of play that we have in the country today, and industry sort of has a pretty serious vested interest in keeping things that way, right? Like to buy the equipment that allows you to operate a large corn and bean operation in the Midwest, for example, right? That is a massive capital investment you face as a farmer, and therefore you're kind of locked into a pretty serious, like, long-term commitment to utilizing that equipment to ultimately pay it off and be profitable as a farmer. So once these systems get established, they really have a lot of staying power on the landscape, and that staying power is sort of always chased by industry that's trying to come up with another product that fits into that current system that allows them to continue to make money off of our farmers. So there's really a ton of industry pressure to keep production across the landscape as simplified as possible at a direct cost to biodiversity, both in terms of the crops we are growing and then the impact those crops have on wildlife nearby, biodiversity in the soil column. You know, it's a pretty massive problem with some pretty powerful interests helping to keep it that way. And as far as environmental pressures that we're facing, you know, the impacts of climate change aren't doing anybody any favors, and the system we currently have in place, where large portions of land are dedicated to these monoculture systems, you know, that's a system that's inherently vulnerable to the pressures of climate change. And so things like massive droughts, massive floods, new pest pressures, the landscape is inherently not ready to deal with these. So we see a lot of traditional conservation problems and environmental problems, resource conserving problems exacerbated wildly by the climate impacts that we're observing across the country, making it difficult for folks to stay in business, produce food consistently one season to the next, and definitely complicating the challenge of shifting from one system of production into another. So those are the two big points I'll make to start, and step away from the mic for a sec.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, it's just, I mean, it's amazing to just kind of think it's like everything, right? I mean, the market, climate, it just doesn't get a break. Nathaniel, through your work with TrueAlgae, you have on-the-ground perspective from farmers as they address the challenges Jesse described above. Could you please first give a description of the specific challenges farmers are facing with regards to the health of their soil? And then I invite you to give a brief description on how the work of TrueAlgae can help address those challenges and why these types of solutions are an important component as we think about preserving biodiversity.
Well, thanks very much, Patty. As Ryan and Jesse have mentioned, farmers are indeed facing significant challenges with regards to the health in their soil. And I think it's useful to try to bundle these challenges into three main areas. The first would be, the persistent use of chemical or synthetic fertilizers, particularly nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, which is, known as NPK fertilizers. All of these are helpful with the immediate infusion of nutrients, but at the same time, they disrupt the beneficial bacteria, beneficial fungi within the microbiome. And this leads to an impoverishment of the soil, and even requires more chemicals to be added just to keep up the level of macronutrients. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle. The second challenge I would characterize as abiotic stress, such as extreme heat, drought, or flooding. I'm sure you've seen reports of severe drought in central California and parts of the Midwest, while Washington State and British Columbia have suffered flooding last year, significant flooding last year. Another abiotic stressor is salinity due to water with high salt content. This tends to impact the pH of the soil, which in turn traps nutrients. So as Jesse was just mentioning, these phenomena will only be exacerbated by climate changes that we're seeing in headlines every day. And the third challenge is really the lack of nutrient availability for the plants. Plants need minerals such as iron, zinc, manganese, calcium, etc., to grow in a healthy manner. In many instances, these minerals exist in the soil, but not in a manner that allows for the plant to readily access the minerals. So, for example, iron in the form of insoluble ferric oxides is pretty readily abundant in the soil, but it's not readily available to the plants unless it's converted to a form of ferric iron that's more or less freed from oxides. So this is a third major problem that the farms are facing. So Patty, you also asked, how we at TrueAlgae are addressing these challenges. We have a product called TrueSolim, which is an organic and proprietary liquid soil booster. containing beneficial metabolites, which you mentioned in the introduction, which are expressed during the cultivation of algae in our proprietary production process. So through genomic testing with third parties, we've been able to observe that TrueSolim has helped stimulate natural microbial activity and signaling, which Ryan was talking about, of specific microbes that help them grow and multiply, really based on the needs of the crop itself. So in terms of addressing the three challenges that farmers are facing, the first regarding the chemical fertilizers, well, TrueSolim doesn't have any NPK in it, and it actually helps to increase the beneficial bacteria and fungi. We've seen by anywhere from 100% to up to 1,000%, depending on which bacteria or fungi we're talking about. And this ultimately helps promote microbial microdiversity in the way that Ryan was explaining a little bit earlier. Regarding abiotic stress, which is kind of the second challenge area, from various studies, we've seen that TrueSolim leads to more robust root architecture, which in turn enables the plants to more fully access water, which exists in the soil, and thus helps the plants withstand drought. We have some anecdotal evidence about how this has helped, particularly with the organic plants. And also healthier soil with more diversity in the microbiome tends to have higher organic content, and higher organic content leads to more porous soil, which is thus more able to absorb water in rainstorms, thereby reducing the likelihood of pooling or runoffs or really wastage of the water. And finally, regarding the nutrient uptake, TrueSolim has been shown in multiple field genomic studies to help with the uptake of iron, zinc, and manganese and some other macro and micronutrients. For example, iron is critical for respiration and chlorophyll production. Without enough iron, plants tend to exhibit chlorosis or yellowing of the leaves due to the lack of chlorophyll. And TrueSolim helps with the production of siderophores, which help transport the iron molecules in a way that the plant can actually access the iron and thus reduce the chlorosis. So without getting into too much more detail, I think this is just three examples of how TrueSolim can help ultimately promote the microbiome diversity and promote healthier soil.
And for those of you who were trying to keep up with everything Nathaniel said, I'm reminding you that we are recording this, so you can go back and take notes, because wow,
Okay.
there's a lot of really useful information there. I'm just a gardener, some flowers, some veggies, but wow, that's super helpful. Thank you. Ryan, throwing this back to you, Nathaniel touched on quite a few ways that farmers can preserve the biodiversity in their lands. And Jesse mentioned sort of avoiding the monoculture of that. Do you have anything to add to that, and other ways farmers can really ensure that the biodiversity stays?
Yeah, I think Nathaniel did a great job outlining that a lot of biodiversity starts with the soil, and when we're talking about creating more functional agroecosystems, we really do need to focus there first. And changing the way that we approach chemical use, particularly synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, is important. But there are a number of other practices that can just help get more life into the soil. One of the big ones that's kind of a top priority for policymakers in sustainable agriculture right now is increasing the adoption of cover cropping, which is just growing a kind of crop in your off season so that your field is covered with some kind of vegetation in the winter. And you kill it off in the spring somehow, but that allows the soil to stay in place and it doesn't erode. Between that and modifying the way that we do tillage, it's becoming less and less common to plow up your entire field every year, and much more common to do sort of spot drilling, seeding things directly into the cover crop that you've just terminated. All of this is an effort to keep the soil there, to preserve the both living and dead roots, helping to get more organic matter to help foster that community of soil organisms. a lot of, sustainable agriculture goes under a number of different names, and each one of them has a slightly different flavor. But regenerative agriculture is kind of the it girl of the moment when it comes to talking about soil health. And it really focuses on that by adopting practices like that, as well as incorporating animals into rotations so that they can spread kind of natural, animal manure in the appropriate place and quantity is a natural slow release fertilizer in the way that we currently use it as kind of a product that comes off of factory farms and is over applied and leaches into rivers has really kind of lost we've really lost the plot on that one when it comes to natural soil amendments. The other thing that, returning to this idea of the monoculture that Jesse brought up, nature, wild biodiversity is fostered by very granular environments, right? Microclimates. We see the most diversity in places that have just physically a lot of layers and a lot of space. A rainforest has an emergent layer, a canopy, an understory, a ground layer. All of these places where kind of life can sort of proliferate, right? And when we look at a monoculture, it's a big square of one thing and a little bit of interaction at the edges between that and the wild environment. So when we talk about increasing biodiversity on the farm, even if we don't bring a lot more crops into the mix, which is a great thing to be doing, when we change the way that farms look to increase that kind of edge zone, increase the surface area, you allow plants to interact with each other. So even, I think within the sustainable agriculture community, there's a much needed call to sort of reimagine on a fundamental level why we have a corn belt. Do we still need a corn belt? But even if you look inside of that, if you intercrop corn in narrower rows with other crops like soybeans, you can see high yields. You can create a more diverse environment for insects and other pollinators. And we can just, by changing the physical space, we can sort of make it a friendlier place for wild organisms while harnessing those benefits. The final thing, and I touched on this earlier, is bringing more diversity into the farm just in terms of what we're growing, right? I think a lot of us as food shoppers, you go down to the farmer's market or you're looking at a seed catalog and there's all of these heirloom varieties of, tomatoes are a favorite, but all crops, originally were descended from thousands of kind of scattered varieties of what we called land races. And over, hundreds of years of breeding, these get winnowed down into some higher performing varieties that produce more consistent crops. And, the way the system works now, we rely on a very small number of varieties of crops to bring most of our calories. And from a food security standpoint, that's dangerous because that leaves us much more vulnerable to, disease, pests, bad weather. But it's also just, helps winnowing down biodiversity into just the few varieties we use now has created these on-farm ecosystems that are functionally dead. And by bringing both the species, varieties, working in animals, we can kind of incentivize these environments that are much richer and much friendlier to the world around them, essentially.
Awesome. Thank you for that description. Back to Jesse. As legislators increasingly understand the importance of soil health and the need to preserve our agricultural ecosystem, efforts to promote conservation policy can sometimes bump up against the business goals of large corporations. And you kind of hinted at that earlier. Can you please speak a little bit about what you see happening in this space? How are current federal programs encouraging or discouraging farmers from incorporating certain climate forward farming practices?
Yeah, and I will jump right on some of Ryan's comments here as a way of addressing this. Just calling attention to, cover crops being one of the things that are like really politically popular right now. And add in that, while we're seeing increased attention from legislators in funding things like cover crops, increasing the number of farmers that are willing to utilize them, a lot of what Ryan was talking about in terms of, additional practices don't receive the same political attention. A lot of policymakers sort of miss one of the key tenets of maximizing the potential of any of these practices, which is they have to be implemented in concert. Right, when NRCS talks about, and that's the Natural Resource Conservation Service, this is the authoritative scientific body within USDA that is meant to study soil conservation and advise farmers on how to increase the benefits of the soil on their farm. NRCS talks about keeping the soil covered year round, maintaining a living root in the soil as much as possible, limiting physical and chemical disturbance to that soil, and reintegration of livestock, all happening on the same acreage as sort of the optimal way to increase soil health within your operation. And it's shocking how few of our policymakers really understand that point and prefer instead to sort of pick politically popular practices to put their sort of political will behind versus sticking to the scientifically valid message we all know to be true, that you have to layer up conservation practices. You have to increase the complexity of your in-field management dramatically if you're going to realistically build your soil health in any kind of an aggressive timeline. So what does that really look like on a farm? That looks like a much more diverse cash crop rotation. Instead of going between corn and soybeans, going in between corn and soy and a small grain and something else and something else and something else, and in between or intercropped with those cash crops, making sure you're incorporating not just a single cover crop species, but a highly diversified mix of covers, right? Some cover mixes will be anywhere from 10 to 30 different species, all meant to help address different resource concerns on that farm, whether it's pest suppression, weed suppression, nutrient management. You can do a whole lot through that crop rotation and cover crop program combination. And as Ryan mentioned, making sure that you're managing both covers and cash crops in a way that minimizes the physical disturbance of the soil. Big wins in terms of soil if you're able to do that. As far as specific policy solutions that exist to sort of push farmers in that direction, we really only have one, and that's the Conservation Stewardship Program. This is the only working lands conservation program in the country that encourages farmers to think about their whole operation when they're planning out conservation interventions. It's the only conservation program we have that encourages farmers to plan for a 5-year interval and not just a single year of practice implementation. It's the only conservation program we have that doesn't just fund up practice, but also enhancements to that practices over time. So in year 1 of your contract, let's say you adopt cover crops on a certain portion of your acreage. In year 2 or 3, you start tinkering with that cover crop program so that it is addressing your nutrient needs for your cash crops, right? This is the only tool in our conservation tool belt, so to speak, at the federal policy level that really is readily implementable to help us get towards that layered practice approach that we want to see touching down on more farms across the country. And I think it's worth noting that most of what is being touted as climate-friendly agricultural solutions right now by federal policymakers misses this point mostly, and focuses on other programs instead of the Conservation Stewardship Program, or instead of programs that would be similar to the Conservation Stewardship Program in the degree to which they would push farmers to do that layering of conservation practices over time and maintain that stuff on the landscape for a significant portion of time. I think that's one of the points I don't think anybody has made here yet today. Real soil health gains on farms occur in years like 5 to 9. So a single year's worth of cover crop that any brand new policy gets into the ground isn't really a win unless those cover crops make it a full decade on that farm. And that's another really important piece that we need, both in terms of addressing climate, in terms of addressing soil health, and most other major natural resource concerns on farms, is we need durability, we need permanence of practice adoption.
Thank you for that. And I noticed a comment here. I'm not exactly sure if it's really a question, but while we're on the topic of the impact of inputs on soil, we have a comment here where one of our attendees likes to use horse manure mixed with hay from the stable, but she's worried about any medications that might be in the horse urine or in the manure. Do you have just a quick response in terms of like how users or farmers can be aware of sort of like, we're bringing in livestock, we're bringing in animals and having them part of that ecosystem? Like, what are some of the risks that farmers may face with that?
You've touched on one of the big issues that we face when we talk about bringing animals into the environment is thinking about the soil and prioritizing the soil almost by necessity forces us to think about other things. And in particular, a lot of animal manure, not just horses, but cows, often has antibiotic residues in particular that can hamper some microbial development. Obviously, it depends on the medication, and I am not a veterinarian and don't know what medication is in play here, so I can't give a quick and dirty answer. But it is true that this is something that we think about.
Yeah, thank you for that. Nathaniel, I'll bring it back to you. From a market perspective, you've mentioned in the past that sometimes regulatory constraints can be a tough variable as farmers try to plan and adapt to the environmental changes they're facing. What are some of the key market pressures that farmers must contend with, and how can they best prepare given those regulatory constraints?
So you're right, Patty. Farmers are facing a lot of regulatory and market pressures. From a regulatory perspective, there are limits to the amount of nitrogen usage in many jurisdictions. For example, in Europe, the use of nitrogen as a fertilizer is being phased out over time. And here in the US, a number of states like California, Ohio, Florida, the use of nitrogen-based fertilizer is being measured and restricted, particularly in the summer months. On the market side, farmers are facing, various exogenous pressures from dramatically increasing input costs. For example, the cost of nitrogen fertilizer has gone up threefold over the last year due to the spike in natural gas prices. Natural gas is what drives the production process of converting nitrogen into a nutrient available form of ammonia. So when when natural gas prices go up, naturally that dramatically impacts the cost of the nitrogen fertilizer. So farmers also face fluctuating prices for their produce. For crops that can be stored, there are futures markets, so they can lock in prices if they want to. But for perishable goods like fruits and vegetables, prices can vary dramatically each week, largely depending on the supply in that given week. So we've seen a great variability with berry pricing, depending on where you are in the season. So these are some of the challenges, market challenges that farmers are facing, which is really outside of their control. So what can they do to prepare for these challenges? Well, really, they have to focus on the elements where they have some control. And I think that's in keeping with these, soil healthy practices that Jesse and Ryan were talking about, like, adding on cover crops, rotation of crops, minimizing or, reducing tillage, and also adding inputs that promote the health of the soil rather than immiserate the soil. So again, it's just a matter of focusing on what they can do, and because they have all of these exogenous pressures, whether it's regulatory or market pressures, which are really beyond their control.
So, building on this, and I'd like to throw this question to all of you. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the role of regulation and market pressures. Bringing it to the responsibility of consumers, what can we do as consumers to help push the needle to get even more food producers to prioritize sustainable practices?
I can start out here since FoodPrint, we mainly take the consumer-focused approach. First, I do want to acknowledge that, and this may seem like an ironic concession, considering that we do focus on the consumer, but the consumer can only go so far. And those other factors like building a more appropriate incentive structure, and broadly speaking, bringing much more regulation to the industry. Agriculture is shockingly unregulated as an industry compared to other industries of its size, and agricultural lobbies have worked very hard to keep it that way. So I think when we talk about consumer responsibility, first and foremost, it's important to remember that large portions of this are out of our hands as buyers, and we need to be engaging with them as concerned citizens. But when it comes to the buying side of things, there's a number of ways that we can sort of rethink our diets to prioritize helping sustainable agriculture and fostering kind of biodiversity. First and foremost, there's not a one-size-fits-all label that works for like indicating that something was perfectly sustainably grown. At FoodPrint, we have a pretty exhaustive label guide that tells you exactly what each label does and does not guarantee. But overall, we're big fans of USDA organic just because it does do the most when it comes to cutting back on chemical usage. There are certainly loopholes and issues, but it does, for kind of the most available thing, for the most widely available label, it certainly goes the furthest when it comes to checking some of the most critical boxes with regards to biodiversity and sustainability. The other thing is the expanding world of regenerative agriculture, which we just tied up a review of some of the new regenerative labels that have come out. So we invite you to go check those out on FoodPrint for more information there. But those are ones that are trying to go even further in guaranteeing that farmers are implementing all of these kind of exhaustive soil health practices that we've all talked about. Yeah, and beyond that, I think obviously there are huge limits to eating local. It's a hard and expensive way to get the majority of your calories, and I think the sort of locavore movement as we knew it 10 to 15 years ago, we've come to an understanding that it's maybe not the way to effectively solve problems. But there is a lot of value in getting to know local producers and talking to them about what they're doing and supporting them as they go on these ventures, whether it's bringing new and interesting varieties to market, or just kind of talking about what they're seeing when it comes to farm and farm policy. So it's not a solution to everything, but getting engaged.
Yeah, I imagine there's not really a magic bullet. Jesse, did you want to build on that at all? You are still muted.
There we go. I wanted to hop on Ryan's first point and concur that individual consumer decisions definitely are not. I also agree that we shouldn't see this solely as an individual consumer's responsibility to solve, right? Like, we don't grow corn in this country with all of our beautiful ag ground because everybody eats a ton of corn, right? We grow a ton of corn in this country because the Farm Bureau, the Corn Growers Association, and other very politically powerful folks continue to make sure there's an opportunity to grow corn. So local food purchasing decisions definitely aren't going to solve that problem. You do very much need to stay engaged politically and stay on the ball to help us move the needle there. That said, I do think there are very meaningful ways to be engaged in the local food movement. It definitely doesn't hurt to buy local when you can. Farmers definitely appreciate that. And further, there are sort of less intuitive ways to be involved in sort of the middle agriculture movement, as I've heard it called, which is, those experiments in aggregating local foods and getting them into mid-sized markets for the sake of, a dependable place for local producers to sell most of their products. things like getting involved inside of your school's district and encouraging your school district to have an aggressive local purchasing program and take advantage of federal opportunities to support that. That can, depending on the community, that can be sort of like a make or break kind of relationship that supports a local food hub, which is a very essential piece of local food aggregation and distribution infrastructure that a lot of areas don't have yet. So there are things like that, that if you want to be part of the solution to helping scale up the local food movement, being part of Local Food 2.0, you know, there are places to get involved, and I encourage you to look for those because we definitely need to crack that nut and need lots of help doing it.
Cool, thank you. And you know, on that topic, I will take the time to do a shameless plug for next week's panel, which we will be using to discuss a lot of these issues. We have someone from 4P Foods who's really kind of speaking to that middle market dilemma, and Delegate Charkoudian from Maryland is going to be on the panel to speak about some of the state policies that are in play to try and push for local sourcing and the aggregation systems that are needed to kind of make it possible for farmers to grow. So should be a good panel. I'll go ahead and put that link in a second into the chat. So on the topic of small and mid-sized farmers, I'd love to hear all of your opinions on why it's so important to advocate for them. I mean, how can they best be supported to be leaders in this effort to preserve biodiversity and the health of agricultural farmlands?
So I'll jump in here. So, you know, first of all, I have a great respect for all farmers. They face all kinds of challenges, which I mentioned before, you know, from adverse weather conditions to wildly fluctuating input prices and market prices for their outputs. But in particular, small and medium-sized farms face additional challenges in that they don't really have economies of scale to lower their capital costs per acre, or even the ability to buy in bulk for input costs. On the other hand, you know, smaller farms tend to have a greater variety of crops per acre, as we've discussed. You know, the larger farms tend to, you know, do monocropping. And therefore, with the greater diversity of crops and a little bit more crop rotation, they have, you know, healthier soil. So I guess, you know, you asked how we can help support them. I think at the macro level, it's partly education. You know, I took a look at the FoodPrint site, and I was really impressed with all of the information they have on that site for education, not only of consumers, but for farmers as well, of the importance of regenerative agriculture. And also, you know, at a macro level, advocacy is particularly important. So, you know, Jesse's working with the National Sustainable Ag Coalition, and they're advocating for more regenerative and sustainable ag, you know, practices. And we just recently saw the passage of the IRA, which has a number of provisions which should help support climate smart, you know, initiatives in the ag sector. So all of these at the macro level are really, you know, really important for supporting small and medium-sized farms. But at the farm level itself, it's really getting and promoting regenerative practices that we've been talking about, the no and low tillage, the crop rotation, you know, healthy inputs for the soil. That's how you're going to change it at the farm level.
I'd also just chime in and add that, you know, a lot of the support that exists for sustainable agriculture, much of that effort does go mainly towards large farms. And the philosophy there is that, you know, if you make a small difference to a major polluter, it's going to be very effective at reducing your problem. And while that's true, small farms can easily be left out of the conversation when, from a, you know, particularly biodiversity standpoint, they do have quite a bit to offer. So.
Yeah, and I am going to put a fine point on that. Thank you so much, Ryan. Since we referenced the IRA in this conversation, I will use that as an example. The Inflation Reduction Act, as it is passed, includes about $20 billion worth of funding for working lands conservation programs. And as Ryan just mentioned, like these programs are almost exclusively targeted at conservation interventions on large farms. There are precious few practices within NRCS's purview of things they can fund that are designed exclusively for small farms, right? So the vast majority of this funding is going to touch down on larger, likely commodity type operations that are willing to make some climate friendly adjustment to their operations. By and large, smaller farms, highly diversified, direct to consumer type farms are going to miss out on this money. And that is a wildly important thing to keep top of mind as we enter the Farm Bill cycle. For those that don't know, the Farm Bill is a massive omnibus piece of legislation that authorizes most of the farm policy that influences the ag system in this country. It expires at the end of fiscal year 2023, which is September 2023, and will be reauthorized at that time for 5 additional years. Inside of the Farm Bill, there are a handful of local food and small farm specific programs. And in total, all of the Farm Bill funding, which is about $450 billion over 5 years, less than 1% of that money is directed exclusively at small producers, right? So we have an incredible hill to climb in terms of redirecting federal spending at these smaller producers that do things like inherently build biodiversity into their business model, that grow edible human food that improves human nutrition when you consume it. You know, we are a long way from where we want to be in terms of federal support for small diversified farms across this country. And NSAC is very consistently working on that. The local food and local agriculture marketing promotion program, LAMP is what it's called. That's one of these Farm Bill programs that we advocate for increased funding for. It includes grants that support the development of small farms, of capital infrastructure that helps with processing and distribution of small farm products. And those things fall inside the LAMP program. We want to see more money go there. There's also sort of like less intuitive changes that always need to happen to federal policy. For example, crop insurance, as is subsidized by the federal government, is not wildly accessible or wildly well utilized by smaller diversified producers. And this is a pretty big problem, given that those same producers often struggle to get insured by traditional insurance providers, period, because their business model looks very different to what insurance providers are used to insuring. So the fact that we haven't solved that problem with a ringer of a federal solution, big disadvantage for the little guy compared to the established conventional grower. And problems like that exist throughout federal programs where, as Ryan said, like those farms just weren't considered or they didn't exist when the rules were written originally. And so there is a lot of adjusting and tinkering and retargeting that needs to happen to ensure that existing federal programs are available to and are well utilized by smaller diversified growers across the country.
Thank you. A lot of really interesting stuff there. Before we move into the Q&A part, and just, you know, we did block 90 minutes for this, so I'm not rushing the panelists too much, but I invite you all to ask questions in the chat, and I'll kind of go through those. But, you know, last ones to the panel of any prepared questions here. What is one thing you wish everyone knew about why it is so important to preserve biodiversity of our ecosystem? Nathaniel, why don't you jump in?
Sure. Okay. So here's how
Yeah.
I like to think about it. I mean, a diverse microbiome in the soil leads to healthier and more resilient plants, which ultimately leads to greater nutrient density for humans and animals that consume the plants. And so that means we all have healthier bodies. So it's all linked together. And so it's all about microbiome diversity and health leads to all of these beneficial impacts. And if we look at the adverse effects of unhealthy soil, you're in a negative cycle. So we should do all that we can to promote the diverse and healthy microbiome of the soil to get all these benefits and get away from all of the downsides of unhealthy soil, which, by the way, include a large number of environmental impacts. Like when you have unhealthy soil, it leads to runoffs and storms, which lead to harmful algal blooms. It leads to greater nitrification process, which leads to nitrous oxide, which is much worse than carbon dioxide emissions. So there's a lot of negative things that can happen when we have unhealthy soil. So it's just the importance of microbial diversity.
Awesome. Jesse.
Gosh, I don't know if I have a new point to add. It feels like a lot of the value of increased biodiversity has already been communicated. But I guess I will say just wholesale the resilience of our agricultural system, and thus just like our country is wildly improved when things are more diverse, both next to the farm and in the production system. Our soil is more resilient to the disruptions we face in climate change when it is healthy and biologically diverse. And our landscapes as a whole are more resilient when there is biologically diverse perenniality alongside all of our farm fields and production sites. And yeah, as Nathaniel mentioned, that also helps us mitigate a ton of sort of traditional natural resource problems that we see cropping up across the agricultural landscape. So resilience is the big thing.
Excellent. Ryan, anything to add?
I'm going to broaden the question just a touch to point out something that I think is really important that's been missing from the discussion so far. And one thing that I think is important for people to know about biodiversity is that it doesn't have to be this way. It hasn't always been this way, and it's not hopeless. We are, waist deep, at least, in what we call the Anthropocene, this era of life on Earth where human beings have so thoroughly modified every environment around them that we don't know what it looked like before. But it's important to note that agriculture doesn't have to be this destructive. And even before, formal agriculture was invented by a number of communities around the globe, human beings have been modifying their landscapes to produce food in ways that actually increased biodiversity. Whether that's through controlled burns, water projects, other things like that. People have been the safeguards and stewards of biodiversity around the world, and that continues today largely through the work of Indigenous people. And so any conversation about biodiversity and food security does really need to touch on this component of equity and who we're leaving out of the discussion. Indigenous people around the world preserve the most biologically diverse areas on the planet. And so as we kind of build out what sustainable agriculture should look like, we need to acknowledge that most of the concepts we're coming up with are not new. They have been practiced by people who deserve credit and a seat at the table. But I again, just to circle back to what I said at the beginning, I think that this is a model for hope. We've created environmentally destructive food systems only in the last few hundred years, really. And there's plenty of time and examples of how we can do this differently.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Thank you, Ryan. Those are it from the questions that I have. I do see one question coming in through the chat. I think, Jesse, you touched on a bit of this earlier in your answer, but Susan asked, what are the best local policies, for example, model policies that we can advocate for within our county to adopt to increase our biodiversity and soil health?
Yeah, I guess I'll echo again, like any opportunity you have to sort of prop up institutional buying power for local foods inside of your county, it's really important. Please do it. But I'll also flag that if you're truly like a conservation type nerd, there's usually a way of engaging with your local Natural Resource Conservation Service office, or at minimum your state office, to sort of help guide the way funding that comes through that office is spent within any watershed you're a part of. Every state has a state technical advisory committee that helps set priorities for watersheds across the state and which practices need to be implemented in those watersheds to improve soil health and other resource concerns. And I believe some states have the practice of further localizing decision-making and prioritization, but I don't believe it's a uniform function in every state across the country. And I gotta apologize for not having a better answer there, but plugging in with NRCS and seeing what options are available for you in your county is definitely worth the effort. And then there's almost always a way to get involved with whatever extension service is available to you, and helping to sort of do some of the just general educational work that's needed on any of these topics, connecting folks for the sake of soil health learning days, or helping to organize field visits or demonstration type things, depending on how how much free time you have. There's always a way to engage.
Yeah, the Maryland extension program is pretty great. And I also noticed in our list of attendees, we have some representatives from the Montgomery County Food Council here as well. So if you are in the county and you're not already familiar with their work, I invite you to check them out.
If I can
please, Ryan.
Jump on what Jesse was saying. What he mentioned, institutional food buying, and whatever scale of government we're talking about, the institutions around us are going to be some of the most influential when it comes to shaping policy. So if you're looking for a model policy that has a lot of potential, I would invite you to look up good food purchasing programs. These have been deployed at various levels of governments, and essentially setting the standards for institutional food purchasing in ways that, once you have standards in place, you can modify them to be more specific. In many cases, the primary, stimulus there is supporting local producers, but these are great molds for kind of bringing in more environmental standards and regulations. Like as discussed, agriculture is really hard to regulate. But one of the ways that we have done it successfully is when people and organizations set standards for what they're willing to buy. And so, yeah, good food purchasing programs and similar initiatives are where I'd start.
Awesome. Well, it looks as though I don't have any other questions in the chat. So I guess we will go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you. I mean, really, Jesse, Nathaniel, Ryan, I'm so grateful that you shared your time with us this afternoon for this. I always learn so much on these panels, and this one was really no exception. So any final words before we go?
No, just to say thank you, Patty, for convening this panel. And I'm really glad to meet my fellow panelists as well. I learned a lot from them. So I look forward to following up with them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We will be putting the recording on the website. I have shared that in the chat. And we'll also be writing up a summary of the discussion today and including in that some additional resources, the good foods policies, the Montgomery County Food Council, the organizations that were mentioned during the conversation today. And we hope that you find these interesting, and please join us next week as well. So enjoy your afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for your time.
Okay.
Take care now.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.